I wanted to talk this morning about dealing with the culture in which we're in. And as I've been looking through the book of Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, I've realised that one of the biggest challenges that the church faced in the early days of its growth and ministry was dealing with the cultures in which they found themselves. Now, what's clear to us is that the Jewish culture, which Peter would have been very familiar with, which Paul was very familiar with, and which the early apostles would have been very familiar with, the Jewish culture was something that for them had the boundaries, had the rules, had the laws. They understood the dietary laws. They understood so much about what Jewish culture looked like. In actual fact, Paul explains very clearly that he's somebody who was an expert at the law. He's somebody who tried to live very righteously. He ticked all the boxes in lots of ways, and yet the interesting thing is that he's sent into the wider Gentile world, and actually we see a great turning point, really, especially in Acts 13, where we're told about this very specific calling. And quite quickly after he's sent out from Antioch with Barnabas, quite quickly they go to Cyprus. They start to make a difference to the life of Sergio Paulus, and I noted particularly the contrast that's laid out quite subtly, but quite obviously. It's quite a contrast. The guy who's really bad and is causing quite a lot of problems and is definitely being a very bad influence on this Roman is a Jewish sorcerer. So somebody who has got some ethnic identity, but clearly he's not at all helpful for the sake of the gospel. Now, that's not obviously all the case. The rest of the book of Acts talks about lots of fantastic Jewish believers, but it's very interesting at that point. It's the Roman, it's the oppressor with his very different culture who's quite receptive. I was just reading through a book recently, amazing and beautiful book a guy gave me. He's actually been a missionary in the Muslim world, and I met him and his wife, and it was amazing hearing his story and reading his experiences of going into a culture that was very different, where people weren't really familiar with Western Christianity necessarily. They kind of had heard of Jesus. They didn't really know much about him. They're aware of him. Perhaps they're aware through the Quran, but even then, maybe they weren't so familiar with the Quran. So they were really quite uneducated in one sense about the reality of who Jesus was and the Christian story. And so quite often we see in the book of Acts this narrative of people going into a very secular culture, a very dysfunctional culture in some ways, very dysfunctional in terms of relationships, very dysfunctional in terms of healthy boundaries. We see the chaos of the life of people in places like Corinth, and dealing with that very, very different culture where the rules and boundaries of Jewish life were clearly very, very different to the sort of experiences that people like Paul were going to have in some of these Gentile cities and amongst those communities. And the people coming from those communities will be having lived a very different life to somebody back in Jerusalem, somebody who had grown up within the synagogue and all that kind of thing. So I just want to challenge us and maybe challenge myself as well, of course, that God calls us to be different in a culture that often might be in a very bad place as far as we're concerned. God calls us to be light in darkness. God calls us to be people who will be transformative. And he calls us to go into those situations, but not to become like them, but to be called out from them. And we're constantly faced with this barrage of the media and how the media portrays what's normal culture, what's healthy relationships, what's normality, what we should expect, what becomes current, what becomes controversial, and then it becomes current, and then it becomes normal. This kind of transition that we're often seeing from what we thought was quite healthy, stable culture to something that is quite different to that. And those norms that maybe we might have experienced sometimes in our life, or within some contexts, or we might have even experienced within the church, for example, we suddenly find ourselves having to face very different norms, or to us sometimes abnormal things that when we go into the big wide world, we experience a very different context. And for some of us too, we might be people who actually come out of that world. We've got maybe a history of being deeply involved in the world the way it is. We perhaps have been used to living for ourselves. We've been used to living the party life. We've been used to living, engaging quite a lot with alcohol and drugs in a reckless fashion, or all sorts of things. Maybe the life we've lived in the past has become quite messy and complicated and all over the place. Not necessarily a happy life, but one that certainly has a lot of muddle to it. And when we come to Jesus, when we find Jesus, we need his help to work through those things, to allow him to bring order out of chaos, to bring his values, to bring his truth into our life, to reorder our thinking, our emotions, the way that we act, the way that we function. It's very easy to get drawn back into that sort of stuff, into old lifestyles, old habits, old ways. It's very easy to get sucked back into the negatives, and it's very easy to be contaminated by those things when we're constantly bombarded with them, when we're in a world that revolves around all sorts of other values. So my prayer today is for all of us that we would be faithful to Jesus, that we would find his values in our life, not through our own efforts and not through our own rule making in a sense, but by the power of God's grace working in us. That we know that that rules by themselves are not going to save us, but the power of God's rules written on our hearts, on our minds, that his truth written into us through the Holy Spirit will enable us to be able to weigh up and discern rights and wrongs in situations. We'll be able to equip us to filter things. I pray that God will give us that clarity of an ability to have good filters in our life, in our reading, in our thinking, in dealing with our social media, and dealing with opinions, and dealing with the way the world is, and dealing with expectations, and dealing with the relationships, and dealing with all sorts of circumstances we find ourselves facing, in dealing with how we connect with others and how we present the good news of Jesus in various ways. So I pray that God would equip us today, that he would enable us, that he would empower us by the Holy Spirit, that we would be his ambassadors, that we would be lights in darkness, that we would be bringers of hope where there's hopelessness, that God will empower us to be the witnesses and the testimony that we need to be in this world, in the times in which we live, in the cultures in which we find ourselves, in the current situation which we often have to deal with the media and with the communications that go on around us. And God would strengthen us by the power of his Holy Spirit to be all that we need to be today, tomorrow, and every day. So bless you, and I pray that you will find that strength and grace and sufficiency in him today, and that your life will be a radical light that shines brightly and that is transformative wherever he sends you, wherever you go, to every place and to every person.